learning from you today.
Awesome. Well, hello. As Steve mentioned, I'm Amy. A little bit about who I am. So my family is from Squamish Nation, so that's the band I'm connected to. But I was born and raised in the Stonewall community in Chilliwack on the Shiacton Reserve there. I'm Two-Spirit. I use she, her, hers. And I'm a school support counselor at Urban Native Youth Association. I have counseling psychology. I also did my B.Ed right here, so I'm used to like coming to all these things, spending my lunch break here, so I appreciate you guys doing that, because I know there's other places you could be, so this is great. And yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about my role as a school support counselor. So my mandate is to work with Aboriginal students in the Vancouver School District with anything non-academic. So I work with them on mental health issues, family issues, relationships. If they're just struggling to be successful in school, it's not the right fit for them, or they need an alternative program. Conflicts between teachers and students. It's really a whole plethora of things. That's just not, they're just struggling with math. Usually that can be resolved by someone within the school. Although I have had students come to me and say that that's what they're struggling with, and I'll usually connect them to a tutor. So I do everything from drop-in lunches, I do workshops, presenting not only in schools and other places that are good resources for the students. They're places that the students are accessing outside of school. So any youth centers, libraries, anything like that, I've got it done and gone workshops there. And then the other part of my job is the one-to-one counseling, where I'm working with the student one-to-one. Anya also has a lot of counselors. We've got a wellness counselor who deals mainly with mental health. We've got a mediation counselor who deals with family relationships. And we've got our A&D counselors, so they're dealing specifically with substance abuse. And mine is always working with students. They don't necessarily have to be attending school, but are attached to the school district. Yeah, so that's a little bit about my role. I was asked when I came into this role if I was going to run Two-Spirit programming, which they had tried to run at one point, but it just didn't stick. It didn't last very long. And they just didn't really have the resources or the time to explore why that wasn't really working. But they did run an assessment tool as to what were some of the issues going on in communities for Two-Spirit youth. And so we'll go over a little bit of that. But first we'll talk a little bit about Two-Spirit. I know that Harlan Pruden was here talking about Two-Spirit and what that was. So if you weren't here for that, I think you can watch it online. It's great. I watched the webinar. Harlan did such a great job explaining everything. But these points just kind of explain a little bit about it. I won't go through everything. It was a term coined in 1990 during a gathering that was made to unite Indigenous LGBTQ folks. And it just felt like it fit with the culture. It fit with what those people wanted to express to other people. And so it is a term that can only be used by Indigenous people, as much as it's a really cool thing to be. You do have to be Indigenous, and it's anyone outside of the gender binary. So it's not a sexuality, it is a gender, although it can affect your sexuality based on how you identify, and of course who you're attracted to and what role you play in the community. So they could be healers, they were mediators, they were counselors, spiritual advisors. These were roles they played in traditional Aboriginal communities. And of course, colonization affected this. It created a lot of homophobia within Aboriginal communities. Of course, when the kids were developing, they were pulled from their homes and put into residential schools, and they were taught that about heteronormativity, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and this changed how those Aboriginal communities saw sexuality and gender. So those roles of Two-Spirit people were kind of eradicated, and they were scared of letting themselves live that life as a Two-Spirit person. However, as time has gone on, they've reclaimed those roles, and that's why the term was created, because they wanted to reclaim that position in the community as someone who had a role, someone that wasn't just another person there, that they were specifically meant for certain things, especially that mediation piece, because usually the women and the men were separate. So the two-spirit people were the ones who could go in between the men and the women and mediate between them. They were often matchmakers because they were talking to both the men and the women. They could help the men who would go hunting because they would go hunting with them. They could help the women with the child caring because they could be with the women too. So it was really a versatile role and really important to the communities. So today, Two-Spirit and queer Indigenous youth often don't feel supported in their First Nations community because of that homophobia that still exists. So they'll move to big cities like Vancouver where there's more resources for them, but often then they're faced with racism or a lack of connection to their culture. And so that's the problem with coming to the big cities. And so even though they're maybe getting resources for being LGBTQ, they're not receiving supports for being First Nations, or they'll find support for being First Nations, but not that specifically support them as a queer Indigenous youth. So that's why these kinds of conversations are so important, because we're bringing them together. That's the intersectionality, those two sides of them intersecting and creating the whole person. So, as I mentioned, there was an assessment tool used by Anya. It's called Two-Spirit Youth Speak Out. You can access it on the Anya website. It's called, Two-Spirit Youth Speak Out, Analysis of the Needs Assessment Tool. So they sent out a survey, and here are some of the facts around who received it. So they were all Indigenous, all identified as LGBTQ, and they either had lived or were living in BC. So 44 people responded back. And the questions were just around the process of coming out, around education for either straight people or people who are LGBTQ, questions around either being in the city or in their community. And so I'll go over some of the really important things that I pulled out of this. Keep in mind, this was something that was done in 2004. So some of the facts are a little bit dated, but I think what came out of it is still really important, and some of their recommendations still hold true today, that things that we want to try and incorporate. So they were asked, is more teaching and education needed for straight people about LGBT issues? So 87% of respondents said yes. I have a feeling it would still be that high today, if not higher, that people want more education around it. They did say the youth identified that it was particularly in school settings, so teachers, school counselors, all of those people are super important in bringing this education. They also talked about taking on educating yourself. So that was the recommendation that Anya made, and it's the recommendation that I make to all people, is trying to educate yourself. It's not the job of LGBTQ people to educate everyone. They're just trying to live their own life. We're trying to do our own things, and we've got our own issues to deal with. So educating yourself is the most important part, and encouraging other people you know to educate themselves. Google is your best friend. It's so easy to just Google terms, or if you hear a word that you don't quite understand, or someone asks you oh, what's your pronouns, and you're like, what is that? Googling that and looking it up for yourselves. Of course, there are people like us who are willing to come and educate, and we're more than happy to do that. So if you can seek out resources like that, that's amazing. Coming here is a great step. So that was the first question. Another one that stood out was, when coming out, I did or do need or prefer someone who is Aboriginal to talk to. So this was quite surprising. 52% of youth were neutral. So over half of youth are actually okay if someone isn't Aboriginal. They just want the support. So that's really important for people to know. I often have teachers who they're nervous about bringing in a culture that's not their own. They're nervous to talk about it. They don't want to bring it up because they're worried they're going to say the wrong thing or feel like it's not their experience to share. And they're right, it's not their experience, but if they're identifying that and saying, this isn't my experience, this isn't my knowledge, but this is what I've been taught, or this is what I've been told, and exploring that with the youth, not as their teacher or their educator in that instance, but just being someone who wants to care and support them in their process of learning about themselves. So that's most important. But of course, that still means almost half of youth, I mean, we had 34% who said they did prefer an Aboriginal person to talk to. So if you can, finding an Aboriginal support for the student is great. Most schools, I know at least here, have the Aboriginal Enhancement Education Workers. So they're a great resource within the school to use to connect them with the student. Going to friendship centers, they're in most communities, especially in the big cities. They've usually got a friendship center around. Of course, Anya has lots of counselors. They're all Aboriginal and use culturally appropriate ways of counseling. And then reaching out to elders are always a great way to connect students with their communities, is reaching out to the elders they have. They asked if a better understanding of Two-Spirit issues is needed in my community. So 80% of respondents agreed with this statement. So this was in their home community where they were growing up with their family, neighbors, and all that kind of stuff, where they're really originally from. So most of them agreed that there wasn't enough understanding of their issues. So it's important to support Indigenous youth in becoming leaders in their community, because that's the best way of helping the community. It's not necessarily appropriate for someone who isn't Indigenous to go into the community and try and teach them things. It's so much better to have the youth teach them to be leaders and how to share their story and how to teach others what their issues have been, and sharing that with their community is the best way to go about it. Of course, there's an understanding in Aboriginal community that the elders share knowledge and the others learn from that. Is something going on with this? Is the computer okay? And so there's an understanding that the elders share the knowledge. So we don't want to overstep that, but what we can do is foster connections between the youth and the elder to ensure that that's a respectful transfer of knowledge and that they have a connection between the two of them, and then the elder can kind of guide that process. So that's a way that teachers, educators, youth workers can help youth bring that education to their communities. Should more Two-Spirit elders be visible in your community? 64% of respondents said yes. So this can mean bringing in Two-Spirit elders into the classroom, into the workspace, into the organization. And a lot of people feel like the Two-Spirit person needs to be talking about being Two-Spirit, and that's not always what it needs to be about. It can be things about talking about the history of the land, everything that is happening with the pipelines, having them talk about medicines in the area. They can be anything, but just having that leader present and having them identify as Two-Spirit is a great way of showing students all the things that they can do and being a strong Two-Spirit person or being a queer Indigenous person. So that's a great way of bringing in more Two-Spirit people. So here's some contact info for me. Like I said, I work at Enya. I do lots of different workshops, whether it's around this, it's around mindfulness, using the medicine wheel, culturally appropriate ways of teaching. I do things around smudging, and that's one of the things about Anya in the counseling that we offer. We offer the use of cultural teachings for counseling. So if we want to use the medicine wheel, or we use sage and cedar in the process of counseling. So that's kind of what separates us from other counseling practices, as well as we're flexible with the times that we can see youth, because we're not tied down by school hours or even by the school building. That's me. I don't know.
Yeah.
So we're going to pass over to Aish from TMB, and your slide
Great. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. I've created this presentation especially for this panel and I don't usually use a PowerPoint, so we'll see how this goes. But it's definitely a useful way to bring in some images and show you some of the things that I'm talking about. I'm noticing it didn't quite sync properly, but that's okay. They're all there, so it's fine. Yeah, you'll just ignore the messy setup. So my name's Aish. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a youth worker at Community. I myself am queer and trans, and I identify as non-binary or agender. I am living and working on the unceded Coast Salish territories, and I'm very privileged to do that. I am South Asian, and my family is Muslim. And I grew up in a working class family, graduated from UBC actually, and some of these things are part of my identity that I bring around with me every day and have brought me here today into my role at Community and into this opportunity to share with you. So we're talking about intersectionality. Those are some of my intersections, and there's many more, and we'll go through how that works. Here's a picture of some of the events that we've had at Community recently. So I run the youth program, and we do advocacy and one-on-one support, but we also do events, and we have a drop-in twice a week. We do a lot of education and leadership for youth, so we do have a Pride Speak program where youth get to be trained as educators. And yeah, we have a space downtown, like Steve said, and there's a youth room where youth are invited anytime during the week when we're open to come as their whole self. And they're invited as such, and they're celebrated for doing so. So what is intersectionality? I wanted to mention and name Kimberley Crenshaw, an amazing civil rights advocate and activist who named and created the term intersectionality in 1989. And that was around witnessing that what was happening in employment. So people of color, I'm losing my thought. So people in the workplace there was a rise in, I'm totally losing my thought, sorry.
There was a woman, she was black.
Yes. Okay, so there was a woman who was experiencing discrimination in the workplace, and she was a black woman. And when she brought her case to court, it was denied. It was seen as there was no issue here. You did not experience discrimination. And that was because white women were hired regularly. So in terms of any sexism that she would have experienced, they were able to refute it and say, no, we embrace women in this workplace. We hire them regularly. And then when the race justice piece was brought up, they said, well, we hire black men all the time. We have loads of black people in our organization. They work in the trades, and the white women are up front. And her case was completely dropped. And Kimberley Crenshaw couldn't believe that that was happening repeatedly, where black women were experiencing oppression and discrimination, but were not recognized for exactly what was happening. And that was that intersection of race and gender, causing a double oppression for that person and many women at that time, and it's ongoing. That's something that still women of color experience. And when you layer more intersections, so trans women, women with disabilities, women of lower incomes, of different ages, these access points are pieces where people are constantly denied the lived experience of what that's like, and we're constantly doing what Kimberley Crenshaw named as the framing problem, that we're using one frame for an issue that's clearly multiple intersections. So until we are able to layer all the frames and say, okay, this is exactly what's happening, it's race and gender oppression at the same time. And clearly, like, no black women in that case, in that employment agency, were being hired. So it was discrimination. That woman was experiencing that, and it is ongoing. One thing that I was reminded of when I was putting this together is the film Hidden Figures that has recently come out about black women's role in NASA, and that it's so easy for us to forget the impact and the influence of amazing Black women, amazing people of color, amazing women in these roles, and it's really easy for us to remember and bring up white people, white men within these industries or within these workplaces. So when we're understanding intersectionality, we have to realize that a person shows up at any interaction, so at school, at work, on the bus, with an interaction with a stranger, they're bringing all of these pieces of their identity and more. This is just a few. So they're bringing, or they may be experiencing, let me frame it this way, racism, homophobia, ableism, ageism, sexism or misogyny, racism, classism, xenophobia. Some of the things that are happening all at once. It's not just when someone experiences homophobia, that piece of their identity somehow is lifted up outside of themselves. They show up as a person of color. They show up as someone who's working class. They show up as someone with a disability. And that can create this really intense barrier for a person to be successful. So when we're in the classroom and we're talking to people, it's really important that we see this as an opportunity to create an opportunity to support our youth and support students. When we're able to layer and name the different pieces of a person's identity and what they might be needing in order to show up to the classroom every day and be successful in your class, we're able to actually come up with solutions. So what I hear from teachers, or what I have heard before on panels, is this understanding of intersectionality, and then this idea that we treat everyone the same. And I think treating everyone the same is a good starting point. It's sort of like, yes, you don't want to discriminate against anyone. You want to accept that everyone is able to succeed in your class. But treating everyone the same means that you're treating everyone as if they are white, middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied, able-minded. And we're sort of expecting people to show up here without really saying, okay, some of my students are low income, they're racialized, they're queer, they're trans. If I'm supporting everyone and treating everyone equally, I have to name who those people are so that I can understand, okay, what are some of the access pieces that I'm going to have to shift in order to allow these people to succeed in my class. Simple things like pronouns, simple things like recognizing if people are having trouble with the class material or showing up on time if it's repeated, what could be happening? Because there's definitely, people are showing up with lots of things to our classes. I wanted to share a few projects and things that I've been lucky to work on in my job to sort of point out and draw out the intersections that we can notice, and then how we can create spaces or resources or acknowledge the importance of those points. One thing that I forgot to mention is that in regards to treating everyone the same or trying to understand how we should treat our students, there's this really great community guideline or rule that I get to use during a program called Camp Out. And instead of the golden rule, which is treat others how you would treat yourself, which seems good, treat others with kindness and respect, the platinum rule is treat others how they want to be treated, which opens up this idea of like, oh, well, how would I know how someone else wants to be treated? I'm not them. I don't live their life. Well, we can ask them, and we can listen to what they have to say and what they need. We run our programs with a youth advisory committee, and the youth in our program, actually, and you folks probably know from working with people in your classrooms, are constantly saying what they need. And it's up to us to kind of like listen and tune in to what we can offer. Our youth recently came up with, or brought to our attention, that a lot of the people in our group are on the autism spectrum. And there wasn't really, sort of similar to what Amy was saying, a program that allowed them to show up with both of those pieces, that they had supports for being autistic and on the spectrum, and then had really active queer spaces, but they weren't able to bring those pieces together. So in our queer drop-in, we really weren't actively addressing the ableism and the assumptions about cognitive abilities or what folks on the spectrum might be needing in order to socialize or feel comfortable in the room. And in the autism group, they weren't really sure. They were kind of nervous of whether they could show up and reveal themselves as queer and trans. So we created a drop-in where folks could come together and meet each other and talk about their groups and talk about reducing some of the ableism in our space and also queering the autism spaces that they access. Another thing is the QT BIPOC youth gathering that Amy's actually leading at Anya. And it's this really amazing opportunity for queer, trans, intersex, two-spirit, people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, to come together as leaders within the queer community. Often we see GSAs or queer leadership groups really taken up by white youth. I experience that a lot in the youth program that I run, that it is predominantly white youth. When trans folks are accessing, it is predominantly white trans youth. There's just greater access, there's a greater ability to name themselves as queer and trans, and so we have to kind of make spaces for folks of color to be able to also step in and say, oh, I'm welcome here as well. There's also the Pride Speak program, which I mentioned, where trans folks and queer folks of color and two-spirit folks are coming together to actually create curriculum for classrooms. And then they've created a 102 version to really enhance the education around what it means to transition at school, or what it means to transition in general, what it means to be outside of the gender binary, and really create leadership within each school or each program, and that's peer-led, so a really powerful program for youth to be able to see that they can lead. These are just two kind of inspirational reminders. And again, I know I've talked a lot, so I'm excited to hear your questions after.
Thanks very much. Can somebody just remind us, or it wasn't on the slide, where is the QT?
Yeah.
It's Britannia Secondary, so it'll be there on January 30th, and it's 25 and under. And they've got workshops that are based around sharing experiences as a QT BIPOC person, telling your story, and then there's going to be an information gathering session where we're basically asking the youth to share what they need from services, what they need in their classrooms, what they need from GSAs, from their schools, from community services, any place that they'd be accessing regularly.
Thanks. Great. Okay, and we'll pass over to Andy.
Okay. So hoping the cord doesn't like disconnect or something. Okay. All right, hi. My name is Andy Holmes. I am a third-year student here at UBC studying sociology. I'm also a teaching assistant in Vantage College for introductory sociology. And I'm also just getting over a cold, so I apologize if my voice is a little rough. So I'm a facilitator with Out in Schools. Out in Schools is a program that gives presentations locally in British Columbia on unceded Coast Salish territory, more specifically in Vancouver here where we do our stuff. And before I begin, I'd just like to give you a bit of information about myself as well. I am biracial, so my mom is Chinese and my dad is British and Scottish, so I kind of have this little mix going on there. I went to Princewell Secondary public high school in Vancouver here. I graduated in 2014, and I was also the student council president there. And I mentioned that, like, why do I mention I was a student council president? I'm just thinking in retrospect. And I think in many ways it relates back to Out in Schools. And Out in Schools is a program that I think encourages youth to feel inspired to be who they are. Like, I would never have envisioned myself to be a student council president at a high school when I felt like I was going to be bullied. And that is why I think, as educators here, I thank you for being here, especially in an intersectional context, because I think more so than I think any time really, we really need to be talking about queer issues in a way that relates to topics of racism, to topics about reconciliation and Indigenous issues as well. So out in schools, we give presentations like this. This is Jen Sung. She is a wonderful facilitator. And we base our presentations through films. So we show short films, and we use these films as a way to show that queer people have lives just like any of us. But why is it that these films need to be intersectional? What does that mean? Like, why does it matter that our representations on films reflect our actual lives? I think this will give you an idea here. Some of you might be familiar that there was a movie called Stonewall that was released quite recently. And this character here, who looks quite frustrating and handsome, if I so may be, for reasons that we have constructed. Why is it that this character, a white cisgendered guy, did not actually throw a brick? There was no person like this character in 1969 in Greenwich in New York who threw a brick. And out in schools, we talk about the representations in films because I think they're a political commentary on our actual experiences. Why would a character be invented, perhaps for marketing purposes, when, in fact, people who were spearheading the movement included Marsha P. Johnson, a trans woman of color who's black. We also have here Sylvia Rivera, and we also have someone named Miss Major. Now, these three people, I think, are less known, unfortunately, and they should be known. And I think they should be known because the history of Stonewall, so as you might be well aware, 1969, the Stonewall riots has largely been interpreted as a movement that kind of started like pride parades and gay rights and stuff. We actually know, historians have argued that there were multiple events throughout the 60s that actually could have become a Stonewall, but were not canonized that way because the event was not mobilized by people such as in Stonewall, for example, who had the resources to reach publications and newspapers and the press to make that story visible. On a further note, though, however, I really want to kind of delve into the topic about the intersectionality of where Stonewall was rooted. Of course, there were other people besides trans women of color who were there, but I think that trans women of color played a pretty important role that needs to be recognized, and that role was when Stonewall was greeted, that's not a good word, was attacked, I would say, by police. I would argue that it wasn't just queerness or homosexuality or transphobia. I think it was class, I think it was racism, I think it was discrimination against sex workers as well. And I think that that needs to be taken into account because the history of Stonewall is rooted in a resistance to police violence and police brutality. And I'm mentioning this, some of you might be aware that in Toronto's Pride Parade last summer in 2016, Black Lives Matter protested in that parade and had received quite a bit of backlash and controversy. And as educators, I think we might be encouraged sometimes to think pride parades are great. And in many capacities, I think pride parades are great. I think pride parades are a great place to have an opportunity to publicly show that there's movement. But we have to be critical, too. Who is not necessarily invited or made a safe space in pride parades? So just to give you a little bit of context, Black Lives Matter was protesting police that were on parades for showing in uniform. Their argument was that still racialized queer people still face violence at rates that are higher than their white folks. And that had received a lot of controversy. But my point is, I want to root this back into the history of Stonewall, that the history of Stonewall was a resistance to police brutality. Okay. And I also want to mention that I think police are often really well intended, and that's another, I think, huge thing when we're discussing controversial topics. I think people are often well intended, and of course police have a very important role in our society. Yet I think police, like many of us in this room, all of us have been socialized to see certain ways of discrimination, certain ways. And that's why I think you all are here for this reason, and I hope that as educators, we have an opportunity now to socialize people, to think critically about what is it that produces people to think through a lens of racism or homophobia or transphobia. Okay. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to just talk about one example that you might encounter as educators and that I personally have experienced, and that's the topic of anti-bullying. So I'm quite guilty to this myself. When I was in high school, I was like, oh yay, pink shirt day, which is coming up soon as well. And as you might know, pink shirt day was rooted in, there was a student who wore the color pink to school, was bullied because it was a guy wearing a pink shirt, and that was gender-based discrimination, homophobia, and whatnot. My issue, however, with anti-bullying day is that I think too often people just call it anti-bullying day and ignore what people are actually being bullied for. And I think that's very problematic because we're not naming if someone's being bullied for racism or homophobia or transphobia or because they're indigenous or because they're fat or because of their gestures or the way that they speak. And instead, if we just say, oh, it's just anti-bullying, just don't bully people, we're actually not stopping the reasons why people are being bullied. But I want to get back to I think that people are well-intended when they talk about anti-bullying, that's the intention that's really important in that case as well. All right. Okay. I'm trying to connect these ideas. I don't like just to go from one to another, but I think ultimately intersectionality as a topic should be regarded as a critical way of thinking. It's not something, and I think often at times, maybe this is a more like millennial term, but the term social justice warrior is often invoked when people are talking about so-called progressive ideologies and stuff. And a lot of times people feel shut down when someone's just labeled as, you're a straight cis white guy. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean when someone is told that? And I think that, for fair reason, I think that it is problematic just to say someone is a straight cis white guy, for example, and not take it into context of what that actually means. So this is why I think intersectionality as a critical way of thinking is not just about recognizing the identities that people hold, but the experiences attached to those identities that are different based on the context of where that person was socialized or lives. Because I think that, I think this in relation to how even the election with Trump in the States, I remember in one of my classes we were discussing I think there's some people who feel shut down when they're labeled, you're just an oppressor, you have all this privilege. And of course, no one wants to be told I'm racist or I'm homophobic or I'm transphobic, that I'm just some ignorant, stupid, racist person. Of course, no one wants to be labeled that. But we're not talking about what that means and why is it that people have been to be socialized in a way that produces those experiences. And further on that, I think that often at times people might have an identity that they see of themselves that they don't necessarily realize is thought of differently from other people. So for example, you might have someone who says, I've been called a cis straight white man, but geez, I feel like I have a lot of pain in my life. I'm working class, I work really hard, I'm barely getting by on a minimum living wage. And I think that has to be acknowledged too, and that's that intersectionality aspect, that class is really important as well in this discussion. Nonetheless, I think how we see ourselves in our experiences is not necessarily how other people see ourselves. So other people might read someone to be a cis white straight man and interpret that identity to mean something else in relation to them, if that makes sense. Okay. And I bring these issues up because I think we've reached a point where I think we've settled that LGBTQ issues is kind of like, okay, it's a given, like you have to be respectful, you have to be tolerant and stuff, but I think that often we forget that it's an intersectional issue, and that's, I think, extremely important. Just on a kind of closing note, I want to bring up something that you might be familiar with. Mary Bryson, a professor here at UBC, debated someone named Jordan Peterson, a psychologist at the University of Toronto, a couple months ago. And just to give some context, this debate was about pronouns and trans issues. For me, this signifies that we might think that we've come really far with LGBTQ issues, yet we still see a resistance to trans issues, which is why there needs to be such a discussion around this. And I thank you for being here, because I think that it's hopeful, like I see hope in you for being here as future educators, and that means a lot to me as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy. We have a few minutes left. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left before people are going to have to dash off. So we have time for some questions. Do we have some people who have something they'd like to ask to one or all of the panelists? Burning?
Out of your like different organizations, is everything free to students? Are there certain bursaries? Like if we wanted to say bring someone into a school that we can apply for, do we just keep?
They're all free.
They're all free?
All free at Onion, anyways.
Yeah, for us at Q, the programs are free for like students and for folks who are clients of the service. So if you're coming for counseling or the clinic or to access the drop-ins or events, completely free. But in terms of contracting out for workshops, we do pay our youth, and it is an employment opportunity for them, and so they receive an honorarium. So we ask that teachers and students and institutions pay towards that to keep it sustainable and to maintain that. And like, again, with staff, it's definitely within my role, and probably for all of us within our roles, to go out and educate.
For the most part, yeah, it's within my role to come and do workshops, so I don't usually ask for anything. Occasionally, if it's outside of the mandate at Anya for my job, I can still do it, but yeah, then I would charge an honorarium.
We do have a fee. I have actually written down here. It's $300 for a 1 to 2 hour presentation, but we do recognize if there's a financial barrier out in schools, we'll accommodate usually, because we never want to turn down a presentation.
Do you want to just say, I know some of the schools where you are presenting in the next little while, just because I have colleagues in the field.
Oh,
Do you want to
goodness.
just name a few schools where you're doing presentations? Not you, but
I can't come off
Oh,
with
you
the
don't?
top of my
Okay.
mind. I
Yeah.
don't coordinate them if I did.
Because some of our folks are going out on practice.
Yeah,
soon, so
yeah.
there may actually be enough schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might get a chance to see one.
Yeah. If you are interested, however, you can contact Brandon Yan. He's our Out in Schools coordinator. If you also go to our website, Out in Schools, I'll just bring that up here.
Brandon was here a couple of months ago and spoke on another panel. Just for your information, you may not, if you're trying to get out in schools, to come to your school this year, you may be out of luck, because I know that they, with the changes to legislation and the directive from the Ministry of Education, they are pretty heavily booked. But hopefully you may see them in a school that you're already at. One of the things that I remember, we held this panel back in December on a snow day, and unfortunately it prevented many people from attending. So we're so glad that our panelists were able to come again. But one of the things that they talked about a little bit at that date, which maybe you can each share a little bit, is just your top reminders to educators when working with students in terms of an intersectional approach. What would be your number one thing that people should keep in mind and do when they're trying to do this work in schools? Maybe let's start with Aish.
It's a big question. Well, when I think for myself, intersectionality has been a really important tool for me to understand that I can't just apply the same solution for each youth, and I can't just assume that, like, if my program is working and if people are attending, so if people are, getting good grades in your class or are engaging, that's just how it should continue. I think noticing opportunities, so noticing the hard things, like maybe the youth that isn't participating, or you know, the module that no one wants to do, like trying to figure out an opportunity to say, okay, what's the feedback that I can be open to here, or what frames or lenses can I be using to understand what barriers people might be facing, and who, like Andy said, might be missing from this picture. Often we hear from folks saying, oh, well, there's no trans youth in our class, or there's no queer kids in this program, and it just simply isn't true. If we're not inviting or naming things or creating a welcoming opportunity for people, we're just not going to hear that feedback, and we're not going to see those youth at the forefront.
Thank you. Amy?
I guess communication is the most important, I think, and I was teaching for 2 years, and my experience was, yeah, maybe I don't know if the kids in my class are queer or trans, but even if they're not, I still want them to understand the concept of intersectionality and privilege. So starting out each year with each class, acknowledging both the oppression I've experienced and the privilege I've experienced, being white passing, being well educated, coming from a middle class family. Those are all privileges that I've experienced, and it changes the way that people treat me. But also understanding that in different areas of my life I've experienced oppression, hearing racist comments being made around me because they don't realize that I'm First Nations. Happens all the time. And so talking about those issues and just sharing about who I am at the beginning of the class, I know that students love to know things about their teacher. If you hold out on your first name, that's a great card to use. I used to do that all the time to get kids to do like certain projects or do something in class for me. I'd be like, okay, at the end of the class, if everyone gets this done, you get to know my first name. So kids like to know things about their teacher. So opening up and sharing a little bit about yourself is a great way to start, and it gets them to start to think about, oh, what areas do I receive privilege in? What areas am I feeling oppressed in? And when you acknowledge all those areas that you might be experiencing oppression, and then talking about some of the other ones and saying maybe it's race, maybe it's, ability, maybe it's your mental capacity, whatever it is, acknowledging those things. And then when you're dealing with the student on an individual basis, asking them what they need support in that moment. Because as much as all these areas intersect, sometimes there's things more at the forefront that are affecting them that we don't always realize. We might look at them and think, oh, well, maybe they're experiencing racism, so let's talk about that. But really their biggest issue is that they're trans and don't know how to transition or need some support in that area. And no one's saying that because that's not being presented visually. So just asking them what support they need, what can you do, what area do they need support in. It's just, asking, having those conversations, but making them aware that you understand there are different areas they might need support in.
Great, thank you. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that did come up in December, the issue of when you're, perhaps if you're involved with a GSA, you want to kind of talk about homophobia and transphobia and being queer. And for some of your students, that may not be top of their mind. Maybe there are issues of income or race or other things that are going on that they really want to delve into and talk about.
So I just wanted to get a sense of how many of the elementary schools are making use of your programming. I know that a lot of the high schools have a lot of active groups with the kids there, but for the kids who are just holding on until they get to high school, what kind of programming is being sought out by the elementary system from your experience?
Maybe let's let Andy answer that, and I know that Andy has a class at 2 o'clock, so he's going to have to go. So very quickly, Andy.
I mean, out in schools we don't do as many presentations to elementary schools, but I think that reflects this this stigma attached to talking about sexuality with kids. And I would say, I mean, elementary school children, if they know about heterosexual sexualities or or whatever is taken for normal, why can't they learn about other queer intersecting topics? That's what I would say.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
If and thank you, Andy.
Okay, thank you.
I know that Andy has to sneak out, so I want to thank you before you go. If you would like, if your question brings up something I did want to mention. If you haven't checked out the website sogieeducation.org, there are a lot of resources on this website. It's just a fairly new website that we've created this year. You can also Google SOGIE 123 because it's intended to be as easy as 123. On that website, you'll find information about policies, about procedures, about best practices in terms of being inclusive, and also lesson plans. And I want to say, lesson plans, the #1 area where lesson plans have been downloaded is in elementary. So more so than the secondary lessons, the elementary, because we can see who's pulling which lessons, and the elementary lessons are the most popular. So we are making.
I do get requests for elementary all the time. Usually it's like grade 6, 7 as they're like starting to transition into high school. But I do get asked to come in and do a workshop with the teachers in the elementary schools. So I do get that fairly often.
And recognizing the time, if anyone else does need to go, I know that you may have classes and I don't want to hold you back. But I do want to, maybe I'll just say thank you to Aish and to